Hello and very welcome to another Demo Talk show. Today I have a very dear friend and my, in fact, professor, Dr. Raghav Sharma, who is a professor at Jindal Global University. And also he is the director for Center for Afghanistan Studies. Doctor, so very welcome to Demo Talk. You
Thank
know,
you.
India and Afghanistan actually have cherished a very historic ties. I mean, even some people put it as, the relations, the ties between India and Afghanistan are as ancient as history, with cultural ties, with people to people connect, with thousands of students from Afghanistan studying in India and having scholarships, with India giving and allocating some $3 billion since 2001 and signing the strategic partnership agreement with India. I think, there is a lot between the two countries. However, the biggest question now, the $1 million question now, is that India is engaging the Taliban. So what is this delicate dance, India's delicate dance with the Taliban?
Well, as you rightly pointed out, there's certainly a lot of depth and a lot of history to the relationship between India and Afghanistan. It predates the emergence of these modern nation states that we refer to as India and Afghanistan. The relationship, ever since the Taliban came back into power in August of 2021, India's relationship with Afghanistan was at a very critical inflection point. India was in a dilemma because it was one of the few countries that held out, um, you know, against the idea of negotiating with the Taliban till the very end. It was an outlier in many ways, and it had piggybacked on the American intervention quite significantly to expand its footprint and its influence. Um, and therefore, when the Taliban came back, India's policy was at an inflection point because India traditionally had viewed the Taliban merely as proxies of, the generals in Rawalpindi. And this was one reason why, amongst many, like many other countries, India had no links with the Taliban when it ruled between 96 and 2001. However, the when the so-called Taliban 2.0 has come back into power, what we've seen is that while India, like many other countries, completely closed down its mission, it evacuated its nationals, and it evacuated Afghan Hindus and Sikhs. Its presence evaporated almost overnight from Afghanistan. But much, I think, to the surprise of everybody, what we've seen is India has tried to very cautiously rework its way into Kabul by engaging with the Taliban, and that re-engagement is part of a larger process whereby India feels that Taliban, is a reality. It's a political reality of Afghanistan today, and if India is to secure its core interests, primarily in the arena of security, um, the feeling is that the Taliban have to be engaged with. There's also a realization that the political landscape, both within Afghanistan and regionally, is very different from the 1990s, when India had a broad congruence of interest with other regional players in not supporting the Taliban. Also, Afghanistan's domestic landscape, political landscape, was very different. So there's actually a whole cocktail of factors, domestic political factors in Afghanistan, regional factors, as well as a desire on part of India to protect its what it believes are its strategic interests, particularly in the arena of national security, that are driving its rendezvous with the Taliban at the moment.
But Doctor said this clear-cut approach of India is having, specs, spillovers over effects over the people of Afghanistan because of this ambiguousness. The people of Afghanistan and India always they have talked about this people-to-people contact. But what about the people? Where is it? Where do the people of Afghanistan fit in this scenario?
I think that's a very valid, pertinent and very valid question that you've raised. Largely because what we've seen is that, even after the Taliban takeover, India has positioned itself very well. On the one hand, as as a first responder to the humanitarian crises that Afghanistan has been experiencing for the last 2 years, coupled with natural disasters, and it's done reasonably well in responding to those crises. Um, but and that response has of course been accompanied by the rhetoric of people to people ties. uh, but that rhetoric of course squares off against a very ugly reality, which is that India has essentially shut the door on Afghans when perhaps they've been at their most vulnerable in recent times. And this has come as a rude shock for many Afghans who had very different ideas about what India stands for, what India is all about. Some of them even had romanticized notions of what India is about. But India essentially, has shut the door on Afghans. So it's denied essentially education visas to students. So there are about 3,000 Afghan students who were either to study in India or were already studying in India and had their visas revoked. It cancelled medical visas, and that has left a very bad aftertaste in the mouth of many young Afghans. And they increasingly come to see this rhetoric is very, very hollow, largely because India has shown no signs of revisiting that policy. Also, what this shows is that perhaps India's policies were not adequately thought through when they were announced. So, if you recall, when the Taliban took over Kabul in August of 2021, India was one of the very few countries, that announced an e-visa scheme. And that got a huge response. There were more than 60,000 applications that came in within the first few weeks itself, an indicator of how Afghans really looked towards India. But again, the reality was that only 200 plus e-visas were approved, and that too mostly for Afghan Hindus and Afghan Sikhs, which in turn has also given rise to perceptions that India's foreign policy, to an extent, has been colored by its domestic politics, whose contours have been undergoing a change. So really, this rhetoric of people to people ties doesn't really square off with what's happening on the ground, because what we are seeing is that the people really have moved to the periphery, and what we're really seeing is a cold, calculated, and unambiguous pursuit of realpolitik um, um, by India. And India is not alone, actually. Most states that you'll see as they deal with the Taliban are engaged in a very brutal, cold pursuit of state interests, which involves supping with the devil.
Great. Dr. Sak, we do understand, I mean, the current scenarios that, after the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, all countries, they try to engage. But I think India was, at the beginning a little bit reluctant. But later, as we see, they reactivated their embassy in Kabul and their diplomats are operating there. And quite recently, in fact, they offered some courses also for the Taliban diplomats. Tell us about that. What has been the reflection of such a scenario there in India, especially in the media? What do people say? Because before that, it was more people were looking at Bollywoods, and it was more of a, some people, I mean, just they say that it was more of a romantic relationship. But now, as you say, that no Afghan citizen has been allowed to go to India since August 2021. So what has been, the reflection in the media there?
Well, in the media, there's been discourse in some sections of the media about how Afghan students have been left out of this people to people rhetoric, and the need essentially to engage with Afghan students. We've seen some reportage on this in the Hindu, in the print, and in the Indian Express. They've given fairly sympathetic coverage to the Afghan students, but that's done little essentially to change anything on the ground in terms of the government really revisiting its policy. And there's been very little movement really on that front. As far as offering ITech courses to the Taliban are concerned, of course, the official response of the government has been that, well, we are not doing anything, radically new. We offer these courses to everybody under the ITech program. But we all know that that's far from the reality, and which is what is being talked about in, again, some sections of the media. That these courses are again one way of keeping the channel really open to the Taliban, because the Taliban, as you know, have been making statements of not just welcoming India to reopen its diplomatic missions, but also to resume its developmental activities and its projects that have been stalled since August of 2021, because the Taliban want two things. I mean, one, they certainly care about international legitimacy. Um, Irrespective of the fact that they don't enjoy domestic legitimacy. Um, and this is one way of, again, demonstrating to the world that, we are capable of engaging with international actors and regional actors. So, it's a good PR exercise for the Taliban. But as far as India is concerned, it's also a way, I think, for New Delhi to keep, its channel of communication up and running with the Taliban. And it doesn't limit their exchange only to diplomatic parleys, but it's a very small opening, in the exchange between the Taliban and the government in Delhi.
But in terms of ideology, Dr. Saib, there is nothing common between the Taliban, being a fundamentalist group, with India being, the biggest democracy in the world. What are, the factors driving then, this romantic ties which we see today?
Uh, well, ideologically, yes, there is very little in common between, the Taliban, which is supposedly a radical Islamist movement, and India, which espouses a very different kind of political system, and that political system at the moment is dominated by the BJP, which is the right-wing Hindu party. But essentially, you, what you will see is that when states conduct their relationship, it is seldom driven by ideology. It is driven largely by the pursuit, relentless, brutal pursuit of state interests. We've seen that in the case of Iran. Remember, Iran is a Shia theocracy, and look how they've embraced the Taliban. We've seen that in the case of China, right? Again, a dogmatic atheist communist party that has been cracking down on Muslims in Xinjiang in a big way, has wholeheartedly embraced the Taliban. In fact, they would roll out the red carpet for them even before they seized power. They've been equated to, China's equivalent of the PLA. And India, in this sense, doesn't really want to be left out of the game, so to speak. In terms of ideology, the one thread that is actually common between India and the Taliban is that the Taliban are linked theologically, at least, to the Deoband Madarsa in India, which is located in modern day UP, which is where they derive their ideological inspiration from. That ideology, of course, has perhaps become debased with time. It has changed with time, owing to a number of factors. But there is that common link, symbolic link at least, that exists. But in terms of what really is driving that relationship, when we talk of states pursuing their interests, it is largely security. There are two or three major concerns that India has. One, they do not want to see Afghanistan return to the situation it was in during the first emirate that the Taliban has established, which is that Afghanistan, really, from an Indian perspective, had become a sort of a black hole where a number of non-state actors, or what are also referred to as strategic assets for Rawalpindi, could operate with impunity. So you had training camps coming up, in Afghanistan in the 90s, to train militants who could then be essentially redeployed to Jammu and Kashmir against the Indian state. So, the prime concern is that they don't want to deal with a situation like that, where Pakistan is able to essentially relocate actors into Afghan territory. It can continue backing them up, and then, if any attack happens, they can say, well, you know go and deal with the Taliban. We have nothing to do with it. So it gives them plausible deniability, and this is a situation India encountered in the 90s. We also had a situation of the hijacking in 1999, which essentially would lead to the release of Masood Azhar, who would then go on to establish the Jaish-e-Mohammed, which would then stage a number of terrorist attacks. So again, the idea is that, re-establishing contact with the Taliban, which is seen as a political reality by many, is driven by necessity of what many argue over here, is the need to really, secure national interests. And they do not want essentially Afghanistan to emerge as a security vacuum of sorts. And the belief is that if they engage with the Taliban, it will give them eyes and ears on the ground. Um, uh, it will open possibilities of sharing intelligence with the Taliban against groups like the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, to be specific, which are of immediate concern for India and are known to have close links with several ideologues of the Taliban and the Taliban themselves. And of course, the overarching concern is that India feels it should not and it does not want to give Pakistan and China a complete walkover in its northwestern neighborhood. And China, has arguably emerged as a very significant player in Afghanistan over the years. It's been in the making for many years, but it's playing a more overt political role in a domain that India really saw as its sphere of interest and influence, so to speak. So essentially, it's security that is the overarching concern. Will the Taliban deliver on it? That is questionable. That is the critical question really to be asked. And I think there are a number of reasons why one may have doubts on it, because arguably, despite all the rhetoric and the public embrace of the Taliban, there is a trust deficit between India and Afghanistan. And while and that's again got to do A with past history, and B the view that sections of the Taliban at least are fairly close to the ISI, right? Even though they don't have a linear relationship. Remember, the Haqqanis, who control the levers of power, have been variously described as a veritable arm of the ISI. And then there are doubts. I mean, they haven't cracked down on the TTP. So why should they crack down on the Jaish-e-Mohammed or the Lashkar-e-Toiba? What are the leverages that India has, essentially? So I think these are questions that need to be looked into and reflected on more critically. And there are no black and white answers, essentially, to those.
Dr. Sip, you pointed out to Pakistan. We see a triangle of Pakistan, India, and then the Taliban. So, I mean, in this triangle, what is Pakistan really pursuing? Because, Taliban are being very much massively, hugely influenced by the Pakistanis, the Taliban. So, on the other hand, India is trying to get closer to the Taliban. And on the other hand, the Taliban, they want to keep the Pakistanis very happy. So, of course, they won't be very happy if the Taliban get very close to India. So how do you see this overall triangle? And what is really Taliban, the Taliban really, pursuing from this relationship with India?
Well, I think the Taliban want to demonstrate to their domestic constituency that they are not merely puppets of Pakistan. That's an allegation that the Taliban have encountered for very long, that they are puppets of Pakistan and puppets of the generals in Rawalpindi. And by reaching out to India, they want to demonstrate that they are first and foremost nationalists who are pursuing state interests by cultivating relations with countries that are seen as being friendly with Afghanistan traditionally. So they certainly want to convey the message that we are not beholden to Pakistan. And India, of course, then becomes an obvious choice given the long acrimonious relationship between India and Pakistan. Two, I think the Taliban are well aware of the fact that cultivating ties with India will allow them to have a certain bargaining chip with the Pakistani establishment, largely because Pakistan has been pressurizing the Taliban to crack the whip on the TTP, which the Taliban have not done, much to the displeasure of the Pakistani generals. And which is why we've seen, Pakistan respond in a number of ways, ranging from, Pakistan voicing displeasure to carrying out airstrikes that resulted in civilian deaths, which in turn led to a backlash against Pakistan, to essentially Pakistan assassinating 4 TTP commanders in the Haqqani stronghold, to essentially, one of the theories doing the rounds that Pakistan is also playing the very dangerous game of backing a faction of the ISI to exert pressure faction of the ISKP, to exert pressure on the Taliban to crack the whip on the TTP. Um, that theory can't be ruled out altogether, because if you look at the history of how Pakistan has behaved, Pakistan essentially supported the Islamists against the monarchy in Kabul, essentially to get them to back off on the whole question of Pashtunistan. When essentially, the Islamists finally got the upper hand against the communists, they backed Hekmatyar uh, for certain reasons. And when Hekmatyar failed to deliver, he was outmaneuvered by Masood. They changed gear to the Taliban, and therefore one can't rule out the fact that they might be supporting the ISKP essentially to exert pressure on the Taliban. So the Taliban also want to demonstrate that they too know how to play their diplomatic cards well. They too can engage with Pakistan's foe to the detriment of India. And I think the Taliban are well aware of the fact that the security landscape of the strategic establishment in Pakistan is animated to a great degree by what India does in Afghanistan, and they perhaps want to, I believe, play on that to extract maximum advantage for themselves.
Great. Dr. So you pointed out to a very good, I think, point. Back in the 90s, we quite remember that that India was supporting, the Northern Alliance, and they used to be called the traditional friends of Afghanistan. But as we see now, there are a few opposition, anti-Taliban opposition groups, armed groups, like the NRF, like the Freedom Movement, and few others. What is India's take now? Is it really supporting them, or is it ignoring them?
Officially, India has essentially not supporting the NRF, right, and other groups that are there on the ground in Afghanistan. In fact, if you see, the opposition groups are largely oriented towards Europe, the United States to an extent, where they've officially established an office to lobby, and Turkey, right? Some opposition figures are in Dubai, but India is really nowhere very much on the horizon, which again tells you that the relationship has perhaps changed, and it has changed for a number of reasons. Because remember, the Northern Alliance, as it's called, or the Harkat-e-Shamal, is no longer there in its earlier avatar, right? That is one. The parties that constituted the Harkat-e-Shamal have experienced a lot of factionalism over the years. So we've seen the Hizb-e-Wahadat, the Jamiat-e-Islami. They've all splintered into a number of different factions. So that has led to a weakening of the Tanzims. Two, what we've seen is that the Tanzims themselves have seen a certain degree of disconnect from their core constituencies over the last couple of years. And this allowed space, I think, to the Taliban to establish a foothold in parts of north and northeastern Afghanistan, where they traditionally were never strong. And this is very significant because when the Taliban swept across the country in 2021, they made it a point essentially to bring down provinces in the north and northeast, which they were not able to capture earlier when they ruled first, in order to preempt a resistance 2.0. And that resistance 2.0 was preempted because there was, if one may use the term, a certain leadership vacuum in many of these tanzims that were seen as having become increasingly disconnected from their constituencies. So there is actually, the Harkat-e-Shamal doesn't really exist, and what is not very often talked about in the context of the opposition is that yes, we talk about the vexed crisis of legitimacy in the context of the Taliban, but what about the vexed question of legitimacy in the case of the opposition? Yes, the Taliban are medieval; they've done many bad things, but then the opposition also comprises of figures who don't have a particularly nice past. Uh, and this again is not surprising because Afghanistan has had more than 4 decades of armed conflict, uh, which means that many of the political actors have a very unsavory past. Um, So there is a crisis of legitimacy in the opposition as well. Not all Afghans essentially are particularly enthusiastic about what the opposition has to offer. The other assessment that one hears very often is that you know the NRF is really, and the others are really a Twitter army. And what one has been hearing from a number of people in the security establishment is that they don't really have that many fighters on the ground. So it's not really a viable force. Coupled with that, I think India is also not supporting the opposition, seeing the not just the changed domestic scenario in Afghanistan, but the changed regional scenario. India doesn't have geographical contiguity with Afghanistan, right? And in order to support, if it were to support the opposition in a viable, feasible, and effective manner, it would be necessary for India to have a broad congruence of interests with at least two or three major players in the Afghan theater. The Russians, the Iranians, who supported the so-called Northern Alliance in the 90s, today have a broad congruence of interest with Beijing and Rawalpindi, and not with Delhi on the question of, supporting the Taliban. And we've seen all these countries have already accredited Taliban diplomats in their missions. They've enabled them in so many ways, way before the takeover in 2021. So, India doesn't really have the heft or the geographical advantage at the moment to support the opposition. And remember, any opposition, any movement, whether it's a guerrilla movement or an insurgent movement, would need a rest and recreation facility like the Taliban enjoyed for many years across the border, and they'd need some logistical base, some logistical supply chain, which doesn't exist at the moment. So I think that's clear, just not on the cards right now, and nobody really senses that there is widespread national resent. A case for a national uprising against the Taliban. There's resentment, but that is not translating into an uprising or a political momentum against the Taliban. And that's not surprising because, look, no major political or military figure of significance is in Afghanistan at the moment, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but many Afghans do feel that their leaders abandoned them at their hour of need. So, there's a crisis of credibility in the opposition as well. And I think it's time that question also needs to be addressed, and it has to be come to terms with.
But Dr. Sabtiris, a very similar question that people ask. They say that, all right, the opposition group, the armed groups, that's, another issue. But what about the activists, the civil society, which India has turned its back to them? For example, over the last 2 years, we haven't seen a single activist traveling to India or India engaging them. What about that? Because that is that is something, a winning point for India, because this people to people contact, and then people used to say that people, India has won the hearts and minds of Afghans back home, but we don't see it now today.
Well, forget traveling to India. Have you seen a single statement emanating from New Delhi on women's education, on the arrest of activists, including Matiullah Vesa, who studied in India, and has been carrying out his advocacy for education for so long? There's been pin drop silence, and that says a lot about the strategic priorities, essentially, of New Delhi. And clearly, these things have become secondary, essentially, to the pursuit of what they believe are state interests. And it seems to me that the feeling is that bringing up these deeply uncomfortable questions, the perception is that it's going to perhaps impair New Delhi's very delicate and nascent outreach to the Taliban, because it is these very things that has strained the Taliban's ties with many countries, that have brought up these issues, and India doesn't want to essentially bring these issues up because it feels that it has other pressing concerns that really need to be addressed, and these things really appear to be dispensable as far as the powers that be are concerned. So there's really not been much on that front, and I don't expect that really to change anytime in the near future, largely because they are not seen as the core interests of New Delhi. The core interest really is seen in the domain of security, but I think that's a very myopic view. The reason being that if you look at what the Taliban have been doing to the education curriculum in Afghanistan, it is going to have long-term ideological repercussions for the region at large. And I don't think neither India nor do any of the regional countries have a plan for it, because they're really going to be impacted by it very, very adversely. And supporting civil society activists was one way, essentially, of engaging with people at the grassroots level. And this again drives home the point that I made earlier, that you know it um, it um, it is really seen as yet another reiteration of the fact that India shut the door on Afghans when they were at, and they are, in fact, at their most vulnerable. In fact, all neighboring countries have done that. And whether it's in terms of issuing visas or accepting refugees, they've all done that because nobody wants to deal with the problem.
But on the other hand, Doctor, so we hardly see any piece on Indian media from Afghanistan about the repressive policies, inflicted by the Taliban, introduced by the Taliban, especially on women. Because, as I said, more than 60,000 students from Afghanistan, they studied in India, and most of them are now stranded in Afghanistan, and especially in particular girls. So what about the media? Why is it silent? Why do we see a sort of silence in Indian media, not covering, the atrocities, and on the other hand, the repressive policies, in particular on women and freedom of expression?
Well, partly is you yourself have a media background, and you'd be aware that the media landscape in India has undergone a change over the last couple of years, and the media, at least the mainstream media, in many ways reflects the position of the government of India in some ways, and the government of India has largely kept mum on the Taliban's policies on education, on women. And may I say that, I think this is really, it's reversed the idea of winning hearts and minds. It's damaged all the good work I think India did over the last two decades, so to speak. The other reason, of course, is that, there are very few media houses in India that have international reporters that have actually been dispatched to the ground in Afghanistan. So there's no first-hand reportage that is taking place by Indian media houses from Afghanistan. Earlier you at least had some journalists doing some coverage. That has completely stopped. So it's really a mix of both factors. One, there is no Indian press reportage taking place from the ground, and that's unlike many Western media houses that have limited, but they still have some presence on the ground. India doesn't have any, and B, the media landscape has changed in India over the last couple of years, and media houses increasingly are happy to toe the line of the government. And what it also again reflects is that you know the character of the relationship between India and Afghanistan has changed, because while there's engagement at the government level, people to people ties have been ruptured. So essentially, it is really strategic considerations and not people to people ties that are driving the relationship. And those strategic considerations again revolve around the domain of security.
Dr. Sir, when speaking about the relations between India and Afghanistan, we see a lot of course, changes over the last, especially in particular, 20 years. When the US announced its troops withdrawal from Afghanistan, we noticed that India was kind of surprised, because a lot of people thought, a lot of analysts thought that were saying that India doesn't have an independent policy towards Afghanistan. It's very much depending and relying on what the Americans do. Does India have now an independent policy towards Taliban-controlled Afghanistan?
Well, there is some credence to the fact that the expansion of Indian influence, as I pointed out earlier, was in many ways contingent on the American presence in Afghanistan, because Indo-American ties had become fairly warm by the time America intervened in Afghanistan in 2001. So a large diplomatic presence and a large number of aid projects that we sponsored in Afghanistan, development projects that we sponsored in Afghanistan, were contingent on the American military presence. And India backed the Afghan Republic um, uh, fairly, deftly, if I may use the term. Um, and the argument again was that India wants to support a stable, democratic, peaceful Afghanistan so it doesn't become a breeding ground for extremism and narcotics peddling and a host of other challenges that the world had to deal with. Right? And democracy essentially was seen as a bedrock of promoting India's engagement with the new political order of the day in Afghanistan. However, what we see is that that relationship essentially has changed ever since the Taliban, have come to power, and what we've seen is that you know India has while its policy was uh, I wouldn't say it was dictated by the US during the last 20 years, but yeah, I mean, it was weighed down by certain concerns that the Americans had uh, regarding India's role in Afghanistan. So you would see that India was very cautious about getting involved in the military domain in Afghanistan because it was conveyed via the Americans that getting involved in that domain would mean stepping on the toes of Pakistan. So yes, strategic concerns that the United States had certainly delimited in some ways the contours of India's policy. America's presence also became a mechanism through which India expanded its influence in Afghanistan. And that, in a sense, would also become a limitation for India because India put all its eggs in first the Karzai and then the Ghani basket. And it held out really against the Taliban for a very long time, which was not uh, perhaps the wisest policy thinking from the perspective of a state. Because all other countries by 2010 had made it obvious that it was not a question of, will the West withdraw, will America draw down? The question was when and under what circumstances, and this was evident as early as 2010. So India really woke up to this reality relatively late, so to speak. And today, as we speak, in the post August 2021 scenario, um, India's policy, I would say, is independent because America's concern primarily has centered around the Al Qaeda network in Afghanistan, right? India, on the other hand, it is concerned about Al Qaeda, but its primary area of concern is the presence of groups like the Lashkar and the Jaish e Mohammed, which are not only backed by Pakistan, but interestingly also have received covert support, by China. China has been willing to risk its international reputation by blocking the sanctioning of people associated with these groups at the UN Security Council, largely to protect the interests of Pakistan. Right? America is less concerned about these groups and more concerned about actors like the Al Qaeda. India is more concerned, really, and more focused on targeting what it believes are groups that are, going to target Indian interests. So they both have a shared interest in countering terrorism, but in terms of what they want to address within that domain of terrorism differs, and therefore, what we see is that they're pursuing their interests, but not necessarily coordinating on counterterrorism, etc. And that's driven again by the fact that they have differing interests. And
With the Mhm. With the
India has.
rise,
Mhm.
yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Yeah, no. Also, I was saying that the United States doesn't really have a diplomatic presence on the ground in Afghanistan since August of 2021. That hasn't stopped India essentially from re-establishing its so-called technical mission in Kabul. It is also, been reaching out to the Russians, and it's been holding parleys with the Central Asian republics in Russia and Iran on Afghanistan. So essentially, it is. coordinating with these other regional actors in the Afghan context, something that the Americans have not been doing as intensively, particularly in light of the Russia-Ukraine war, in light of the friction in the relationship between Tehran and Washington. So India has been doing that as well, um, largely taking into account the changed geopolitical context at the regional level.
Taking into consideration the rapid developments lately, especially in terms of the relationship between India and the Taliban, do you see a Taliban envoy soon coming and leading the Afghanistan mission in Delhi?
I wouldn't rule that out altogether. Um, I wouldn't rule that out, and I think a lot of it depends on um, what the Taliban are also able to deliver. They've been talking about the need to share intelligence, actionable intelligence, and the Taliban acting on that actionable intelligence. Um, if they do that, and if there are certain other deliverables that I'm sure that they've worked out through back channels, I wouldn't rule out the possibility, essentially, of India, um, you know, if not uh, hosting a Taliban envoy and accrediting Taliban diplomats, at least accepting appointees that the Taliban chooses from the embassy in Delhi. Um, so I won't rule that out in the near future. In fact, there's been buzz in the media as well on this. At one stage, there were reports that Abdul Kahar Balkhi, who holds a Kiwi citizenship, and his family enjoys a great life in New Zealand, was tipped as the Taliban's choice for replacing the current incumbent as ambassador. That hasn't come through as yet. So the fact there is buzz on this means that clearly there's been some thinking this is being poured over in New Delhi, and one can't completely rule it out.
Mhm. In the current scenario, a lot of countries talk about, inclusive government, the Taliban going towards negotiations with the opposition group and making peace with the people of Afghanistan. Is India on the same page?
Same page for inclusive government?
Inclusive governments for negotiations and all that.
Well, look, one is the rhetoric of an inclusive government and negotiations. We haven't heard much from India on that, on either inclusive government or negotiations. Uh, and I think the question really to ponder over in this context is, what do we mean by inclusivity? By inclusivity, do we mean a government that is, you know, ethnically inclusive? Something that Lakhdar Brahimi had talked about in 2001, that we have, 11 Pashtuns and 9 Tajiks and 8 Hazaras in the government, so on and so forth. Is that inclusivity? Or are we talking of inclusivity in terms of gender representation, political diversity? What is inclusivity? I think that is something for everybody to ponder over. And the second thing that one needs to ponder over is that, I mean, why should the Taliban have an inclusive government? They feel that they have won a military victory against the United States, which is arguably the most powerful. It's got the most powerful military in the world, and it led a coalition of NATO countries into Afghanistan, and was, effectively, forced to beat a retreat, and a fairly humiliating retreat after 20 years. So many in the Taliban movement perhaps feel that, why should we have an inclusive government? What is the obligation that we owe to the world to have an inclusive government? We don't need it. And I think in New Delhi, the feeling is that, this is something the West essentially talks about, but that doesn't really concern us. And India has usually been very circumspect, not just in the case of the Taliban, but you'll see, for most neighboring countries, particularly, it's been very circumspect about commenting on internal political affairs. Right? India has dealt with a number of unsavory regimes in its neighborhood. Look at the military junta in Myanmar. Right? There was initially a lot of rhetoric, a lot of support about democracy and supporting Aung San Suu Kyi, but all of that over time got watered down for a number of reasons. And Afghanistan, is not very different in that context. So inclusivity is not really talked about. And as far as the opposition is concerned, again, the perception in Delhi is that the opposition right now doesn't really pose any serious challenge to Taliban rule, because the opposition doesn't have fighters. The opposition is deeply fragmented. You have at least a dozen fronts that have come up, but very little political or military coordination between them. And India will not support an opposition unless there is something more tangible to show on the ground, and b, it finds a congruence of interest with either Iran or Russia. Without that, it is impossible to support an opposition group.
All right, Doctor, so we are coming to the end of the program, but as a last question, what are some of the takeaways that our audience can get, and some of the recommendations that you might have for the current scenario, for India, for the policymakers, for the opposition group, for the civil activists, and for India's traditional friends?
Well, I must say India's traditional friends essentially feel let down, because they feel India abandoned them after 20 years, and didn't really reach out essentially to them in the aftermath of the fall of Kabul. And I think that's a genuine grouse that they have. Look, India certainly has genuine security concerns emanating from developments that take place in Afghanistan. And India is clearly worried about, the repercussions that this will have, on the security scenario in Kashmir, which has had a history of, distant links to Afghanistan. And we've seen ever since the fall of Kabul, ever since the fall of the Republic in Afghanistan, we've seen a lot of the American military equipment, ranging from night vision devices to rifles to, armor-piercing bullets, being found in Jammu and Kashmir in encounters that the security forces have had. There's a fear that there's also the use of sticky bombs that is totally alien to the Kashmir Valley. They were used widely by the Taliban when they targeted the ANDSF and NATO, but they were never used in Kashmir. They have also made their way into the Kashmir Valley. So certainly there's a fear that it's going to change the contours. It's going to change the character of the militancy in the Kashmir Valley. That fear certainly is there. It's not going to alter the power asymmetry, but it will A, change the character, and B, what it perhaps points to from a security perspective for the state is that these actors will have access to sizable firepower for a long time to come. So that is a genuine concern. The second concern essentially is radicalization, which is not a new phenomenon in this part of the world. After all, we've seen radical movements in this part of the world way back in the 19th century as well. But the challenge really is that India and many other states don't really have a policy in place to counter that radicalization, right? Everybody is talking about women's access to education, which needs to be talked about, and I think India has not talked about it enough. It, in fact, has not talked about it at all. But what is equally important is what kind of education is being churned out in the school curriculum. The boys who are going to school, what kind of education are they getting? Have we reflected on that? I'm afraid we have not, and this is a serious question for India, really, I think, to ponder over. Largely because, remember, whenever there's a regime change, most regimes target the education curriculum, because that's the easiest way to indoctrinate people on a mass scale. And the changes that the Taliban have been bringing about with the education curriculum, I don't think augur well for the future. And it is in this respect, I think India needs to reach out to civil society actors, grassroots actors in the region, who in the long run essentially can really offer an effective bulwark to deal with the ideological challenge that groups like the Taliban present to the region at large. And India in particular would need to pay attention to this, because India is a diverse social mosaic. We have a large Muslim population, and I think it is in India's interest essentially to cultivate ties with these grassroots actors to ensure that the impact of this kind of ideology that is being churned out at the school level can be mitigated. It can't be eliminated, but it can be mitigated. And we perhaps have some lessons to learn from, movements like the PTM, for example, which has been the only force that has stood up to the Taliban in their proxies in the tribal areas of Pakistan. What India also needs to be mindful of the fact is that, yes, the political landscape of Afghanistan has changed, but the social landscape has also changed. Taliban in their first avatar did not encounter protests by women, however small. Uh, they are encountering these protests till date by Afghan women, and the Taliban really are in a dilemma in terms of how to deal with these protests that are A, non-violent, and B, are by women. So, on the one hand, the Taliban talk about Afghaniyat and Ghairat, but, the way they've been dealing with women protesters betrays that. So I think India needs to cultivate that constituency and engage them, because they can be agents essentially for constructive social change in the long run. Third, India has been talking about winning hearts and minds, people to people contacts. I think in this respect, India seriously needs to revisit its visa policy. It should certainly issue visas to students who are stuck in Afghanistan and have been denied access to education in India. It needs to start issuing medical visas. This whole policy of only evacuating Afghan Hindus and Sikhs, it doesn't augur well for India's image. It only reinforces the idea that India's domestic politics is beginning to color essentially its foreign policy, and this is something I think that doesn't do any good to India, and that's a policy I think India would do well to revisit. And it's really shocking that ever since the fall of Afghanistan, there is not a single Indian higher education institute that is part of a scholars at risk network. Most Western universities are part of a scholars at risk network. So they've attracted some of the best Afghan minds. It's a loss for Afghanistan, yes.
The cream of the crop, will be called.
Yes, they've managed to create a fairly vibrant community amongst the diaspora to produce who are going to be very important to churn out counter narratives to what the Taliban have to say in terms of what Afghaniyat and what Afghan culture and Islam is all about. And India, which is geographically, culturally proximate to Afghanistan, has had a long history of contact, really has shied away from all of this, and this is quite disappointing, and this perhaps again has to do with the fact that universities are finding it very difficult to navigate the Indian bureaucracy, which has essentially buried its head in the sand and doesn't want to talk about visas or talk about revisiting its policy. So I think that's something it will have to do at some point.
Thank you, Dr. Raghav Sharma, for your very insightful perspectives on India-Afghanistan relationship, especially the Afghanistan controlled, ruled by the Taliban. So for our audience, please stay tuned for more conversations and follow Afghanistan Center for Peace and Democracy. Thank you, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you.